say this. These Mirage 3s were in different configuration. There were 3 variants of them because those days you had to have dedicated aircraft. Dedicated for reconnaissance, which we just spoke about, and air-to-ground attack aircraft, and air-to-air combat aircraft. From then on, this country began to be really cornered from all over via sanctions. And the Armaments Corporation, or what we now call AMSCO, in short form, began to play a key role in arms acquisition for this country, and together became increasingly independent in supplying arms to the SANDF, or the SADF at that time. The country at that time saw conflict and threats from all around, and therefore the defense budget grew, and over that it fell upon in order to fund, develop, and sustain a formidable fighting machine. And the South African Air Force was part of this.
Right. In page 4 of your statement, the next paragraph that I'd like you to deal with is paragraph 19, which deals with the era mid-60s to early 70s, which deals with the phasing out of the Vampire, the 3-tier system, and as well as the introduction of the Impala MK2. You may proceed to tell the Commission about that here.
Mr. Chair, the Commission will recall that on Wednesday we had mentioned that this country had acquired Vampires and Sabres, and with that introduced the 3-tier training system for fighter pilots. At this point in time, where paragraph 19 is concerned, those Vampires had come to the end of their useful life. And these were replaced by the Impala Mark II and Mark I. Impala Mark I was the trainer for fighter pilots, and Impala Mark II was a light attack aircraft. These were built under license from Air Marchi in Italy. They were built by the Atlas Corporation in South Africa. 151 of them were built in total. In the mid-70s, in order for the country to reach or to have strategic reach and start the latest technology, it was deemed fit that the South African Air Force acquired 2 variants of the Mirage F1. These were acquired from France, a company called Dassault. There were 16 of this and 32 air-to-ground variants of these aircraft. So all in all, there were 48 Mirage F1s that were acquired. These aircraft also had a capability that we call in-flight refueling or air-to-air refueling. Remember, I just said strategic reach. So these could fly to a point where they needed refueling, then another aircraft, which was used as a tanker, or is used as a tanker, will come in and then they just slot behind it and refuel from that aircraft in the air. The South African Air Force then retained a three-tier training system, and it was the Harvard to Impala then, at that point, the Harvard at Central Flying School. After qualifying, getting your wings for basic flying, then you go to the Impala Mark 1 if you were streamed as a fighter pilot. From the Impala Mark 1 then to the operational aircraft. In this case, all the variants that, or all the types that we've mentioned, the Mirage 3, Mirage F1, and the Impala Mark 2. Also in this period, when the Sabres were decommissioned, they had reached the end of their useful life also. But at this point in time, this Air Force had 355 fighter and bomber aircraft. 355. This is the mid-80s towards the late 80s. Today, all in all, we have only 52 fighter aircraft. That's about 15% of what this Air Force was in the 80s.
General, thank you. Are you able to comment as to why it is that we currently have 52 fighter aircraft, whereas way back in or around the 80s, the South African Air Force was sitting with about 355 jet trainer fighter and bomber aircraft?
Mr. Chair, probably I should say, to me, there are two or three main reasons. I'm saying two or three because I think two of them are linked. But the first one is this country was no longer at war. So as a democratic country now, promoting good relations with everybody. The Cold War was over. The world was no longer polarized. And by the way, with this, it was not unique to South Africa. Many countries around the world had to scale down their level of defense ambition. But there are two other factors in my mind. One is that technology has played a key role. We mentioned three variants of the Mirage 3 aircraft. We no longer need three variants. So there's no longer a need to buy a big or to acquire a big fleet, because the capability we have now is multi-role or swing role, depending on how you look at it. One platform can do all reconnaissance, air-to-ground, air-to-air. But lastly, and linked to the technology, you spend less money in buying modern technology. You buy less platforms. But in 1990, the first biggest defense cut in terms of budget happened. So there was no longer that big pay available to the defense force as it was before 1990. Secondly, in 1997, just when these SDPPs were being lifted, there was another huge budget cut. So the choice of technology rather than numbers was also influenced by the budget. So these two are linked in my mind.
I'm sorry, Mr. Sloan, just from my own understanding. General, I think in your statement you say that in the 80s you had about the Air Force had about 250 jet trainer, fighter, bomber, and reconnaissance aircraft. And you say they were acquired from various manufacturers. And now you say today we have only 52 fighter aircraft. And my question is, at the time, out of the 315 aircraft that you referred to, how many of them were fighter aircraft?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All of that 355 were fighter aircraft in terms of categorization. So they all fell under the, nowadays I would say, director combat systems. Meaning, whether it was a bomber aircraft or reconnaissance aircraft, in as far as being either a Mirage 3 or a Canberra or a Buccaneer, they were all in the category of fighter aircraft. This 355 I'm referring to doesn't include transport and maritime aircraft, doesn't include helicopters.
General, will you then, you have made mention of the fact that there were serious budget cuts over a period commencing from the 90s or from 1990. Can you just give the Commission an indication of the extent of the budget that was committed to the defense force at the time, and also indicate as to present what is the percentage that is allocated to the defense force?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. By the mid-80s, the defense budget was 4.7% of GDP, almost 5%. If you look at it in terms of total government expenditure, it was 25.7% of total government expenditure. Today, the defense budget is about 1.2% of GDP and about 16% of total government expenditure. I speak under corrections, but that's particularly today's figures. I know it's there about 1.2% of GDP.
I think we shall then proceed to paragraph 21, where you are talking about the further technology development within the armament industry, and also proceed to paragraph 22, which deals with how the South African Defense Force responded to this advancing technology in terms of operation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're talking now about the 80s. And worldwide, what was happening is a new generation of fighter aircraft was being either researched or being developed. These aircraft were mainly fly-by-wire, what we call fly-by-wire, meaning there's a central computer on board. When a pilot puts in an input, whether turning or climbing up or descending, the computer deals with what we call the flight surfaces on the wings and the tail and things like those of the aircraft. But now the cockpits were going digital also, from analog. Meaning you could now integrate flight information with other information that's coming in, whether the weather radar, what you detect on the weather radar, what you get with your cameras and whatever sensors are on board. All that information could be integrated to form a picture for the pilot or the crew. These were tailored fourth generation fighter aircraft. Examples of these would be the MiG-29, the Mirage 2000. MiG-29 is the Russian fighter. The Mirage 2000 is a light fighter made by Dassault again in France. The F-16 of the Americans. Even though some were at different stages of development, and some, the initial thrust would be altered by new things in technology, but ultimately whatever came out was a new generation of fighters. Now with countries like Israel, also particularly the Israel aircraft industry, it also started to upgrade its own aircraft into the digital era and to incorporate electronic warfare suites that were far more advanced. South Africa took that opportunity because there was pressure also to not be left behind technologically. That's when the Mirage aircraft was worked on with these new digital electronic suites into what now we call the Cheetah. So the Cheetah was a modernized Mirage 3. Mr. Chair, I don't know if I've answered the question properly.
Right. From evidence, it would appear that the cheetahs were only faced in late in the 80s, and deliveries were also done even in the early 90s.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, will you please inform the Commission about the question as to whether the cheetahs did get sufficient time to participate in the operations, or whether they did participate in the operations at all?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, it's true. I think the last delivery of the Cheetah was in 1994. And to answer the question specifically, they never participated in operations. And also, I want to clarify this fact. The Cheetah was not a brand new aircraft, by the way. It was the Mirage 3, upgraded to a digital cockpit and a few other tweaks of the airframe. Thank you.
Was the upgrade done in South Africa? Is the South Africans that acquired the license to upgrade the Mirage, or was it the British?
Mr. Chair, this was a joint venture between South Africa and Israel. But yes, Denel Aviation played a role in that upgrade.
Right. then the dawn of the, or rather, then we shall proceed to deal with the acquisition of the helicopters. But please just close off the acquisition relating to fighter aircraft.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We did mention the 1990 defense budget cut, and we did mention the 1997 budget cut. Because of that, amongst other factors, it was no longer viable because the size of the Air Force was no longer affordable. End of their useful life. So many platforms were phased out or beginning to be phased out. Amongst them, is the Mirage, and the Impala also was close to the end of its life. I must say, the or the reconnaissance, this thing. They were also phased out, but later on.
Just before we start dealing with the helicopters, I noticed from your statement that the South African government has been involved in the acquisition of the licenses to, or the license to manufacture from as far back as the mid-60s. In that way back then, there was a license acquired for the production of the Impala Mk2, and further on, there was later a license acquired for a joint production of the Cheetah, which was actually an upgrade of the Mark.
Of the Mirage 3.
Of the Mirage. Now, that concept of buying a license to produce, was it also factored in respect of the acquisitions relating to the SDPTs?
Mr. Chair, I'll explain that this way. That if you recall, or if you read, it is recorded that in 1960, the United Nations declared apartheid a crime against humanity, which, according to the UN Charter, that's one of the most serious crimes, like genocide and things like those. So many countries started being apprehensive in doing business with South Africa. But moving forward, coming from the 60s up to the mid-70s, maybe late 70s, many other countries decided not to do business with South Africa. So the sanctions also picked up speed around that time. So the stance of the South African government was try as much as is possible to be self-sufficient, to rely on domestic capability in terms of manufacturing as much as it is possible. So the local industry was developed. Many people were trained in specialized skills in the aviation industry. but also in the munitions industry in general. So, where possible, where they manage to have partners out there, that opportunity was taken. And a country such as France was really open to this. Probably others were doing it under the table, but France was open. Israel was a close ally of this country at that time. So actually a formidable local industry was developed. And had it wasn't interrupted one way or another, I believe it would compete with many around the world. With that, obviously going forward, the country would like to not only retain but improve on those scarce, highly specialized skills. So in my mind, even though I didn't participate in this personally, in my mind, I think that was a huge consideration, Mr. Chair, to say going forward, whatever we acquire must have a local content, because it is strategic to have the country have those scarce and specialized skills in aircraft or in the aviation industry or in munitions generally.
Right. Shall we then proceed to paragraph 24, which is on page 5 under G, Mr. Chair? This is the introduction of the subject relating to helicopters, the dawn of the helicopters within the South African Defence Force. Shall you please take us through?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With regard to helicopters, I can say that the helicopter was introduced into battle in the latter stages of the Second World War. But the development and the research around that started much earlier. In fact, just about at the end of the First World War, or around the First World War. But the science involved with helicopters is a bit tricky, because here you don't have a fixed wing. So the forces acting are similar but slightly different. Here you're dealing with centripetal force, centrifugal force, and things like those. It took a long while, I think, to get the helicopter up to an operational stage. So it was introduced in the latter stages of the Second World War. And even after the end of the Second World War, it hasn't become evident or clear enough as to how this new invention could be used in battle. And this is the Korean War happened. So between the end of the Second World War and the advent of the Korean War, people like Sikorsky, who was a pioneer in the development of, or one of the pioneers in the development of helicopters, kept working on improving this thing. So they took the opportunity in the Korean War to see how it can be used. And the South African Air Force was participating in the Korean War as part of the United Nations. Our crews that were there saw how helicopters are being used, largely for medical evacuation, for observation, or resupplying of troops and things like those. And it began to dawn on many people that this invention can and is useful in battle. In the late 50s then, South Africa acquired 3 helicopters. These were the Sikorsky S-51. In fact, 4 of them. 1 Sikorsky S-51 and 3 Sikorsky's S-55. One can say these were more or less the first generation of helicopters that had some utility, practical utility. South Africa used these 4 helicopters mainly for the eradication of tsetse flies on the northern parts of South Africa, along the Limpopo River and places like that. But with the advent of turbine engines, a new age dawned for helicopters. And South Africa acquired the Alouette 1 helicopter from France, which had a turbine engine. These were primarily used for training helicopter pilots. And then in 1962, South Africa acquired Alouette 3s, which were light utility helicopters. In today's terms, you can say they are in the class of the A109, whose model is up there.
Shall you then please take us through the acquisition of the different grades of Alouettes and the rest of the helicopters? Because we have the Alouettes 2, the Alouettes 3,
Yes,
and
ma'am.
if you, as you take us through, please also explain the use of those helicopters.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would start by making a correction. Yes, ma'am, you're correct. The first acquisition was the Alouette 2 with the turbine engine. That was used for training, to train the graduates from Central Flying School who were flying the Harvard, got their wings, and have been streamed for the helicopter line. They were then introduced to helicopters with this Alouette 2. The Alouette 2s were acquired in 1961. In 1962, Alouette 3s were acquired. As I said, this was the standard or main light utility helicopter used by the South African Air Force.
May I just inquire, with regard to the use of the helicopters, did the South African Defence Force maintain the 3-tier system?
Mr. Chair, that would be correct because all pilots, their ab initio training was done with the Harvards at the Central Flying School. Now, with the Alouette 2 and Alouette 3 in place, it meant those that were streamed for the helicopter line will qualify on the Harvard in terms of basic flying, and then have to be trained on the Alouette 2 before they go to operational helicopters. So, yes, it was a three-tier system also.
Now, can you explain that three-tier system, assimilating it to the equipment that was acquired through the SDPPs within the helicopter environment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as far as the SDPPs are concerned, in this case, we are referring to the Alouette, or rather the Agusta A109. So it's still the same case, Mr. Chair. All basic flying training or initial training happens at Central Flying School using the Pilatus PC-7 Mark II. When youngsters qualify there and they are streamed to the helicopter line, they then are trained on the A109. When they qualify the operational conversion course, flight commander and things like those, then they move on to the Oryx. On Wednesday, my colleague Gerald Berger showed what he called a progression of, that's exactly that picture. It's a tier system.
Right, thank you, General. Then you can proceed to inform the Commission about the various other types of helicopters that you thought we were looking at.
Okay, ma'am. Mr. Chair, the Alert 3, or the Alert 3, yes, had been acquired for largely to do scouting and liaison work, scouting, observation, patrolling and things like those. And then further batches of this type were brought between 1967 and 1975. By which time, this Air Force, the South African Air Force, had gained enough operational experience on helicopters, particularly the Alouettes, and at some point in time they worked with the Rhodesian Defense Force in counter-insurgency operations, or counter-terrorist, depending on which term you use, but unconventional warfare, and they were used for reconnaissance, for command and control, and trooping. Around this time also, South Africa acquired what was called the WASP helicopter, and it was mentioned earlier by my colleagues, particularly from the Navy. The WASP helicopter was a dedicated maritime helicopter. It was largely used for anti-submarine warfare. It carried torpedoes, and then also another acquisition was the Super Phelon heavy lift aircraft. The Phelons were then delivered from 1967 to 1969. The same year, 1969, the South African Air Force ordered its first Puma medium transport helicopters. Immediately, a few years after that, the Alouette 2 was phased out in 1974. And the Alouette 3 then assumed or became the primary helicopter trainer. Because now we had the Pumas in place. As the conflict, or what was then referred to as the Bush War, escalated, it became obvious that for particularly the Puma, in terms of deploying it swiftly, redeploy, supply troops over difficult terrain, and the absence of roads. Something needed to be done with this to improve its performance and utility. Analysis or analyses were done. Then the South African Air Force chose the Puma, and the Puma generally proved to be useful in those roles that I mentioned. But also, because of analysis being done, it was found out that this Puma can be improved. Local industry, Denel or Atlas Corporation, obviously with collaboration from other people, a study began to see how they can improve this Puma aircraft. But in the meantime, the Anwar 3, the Puma and the Super Freelon were used in various operational areas in the bush war and things like those. Denel, the South African Air Force and whoever else was involved in the development of a better performing Puma in a hot and high environment and things like those, really accelerated their work, and this resulted in the locally developed Oryx medium transport helicopter, where the engines, main and tail rotor blades, main, intermediate and tail gearboxes, amongst others, were industrialized and could be used by the developing Roy Falk combat support helicopter and an upgrade of the Super Freelon. The Oryx flew first in 1987, but in 1989 the Freelon, the Super Freelon, was phased out, and in 1992 the replacement for the Anwar 3, which was the LUH, the replacement project thereof began. This is 1992.
Just before we proceed, Mr. Chairperson, I see it is now 20 past 11. I'd like to inquire from the chair as to what is the time earmarked for the agenda.
Let's adjourn for 15 minutes.
Chair. Mr. Chair, on Wednesday I did mention the fact that there are three core characteristics of air power. And those are speed, reach, and fire and height. And all of those over the years, it was realized that there are certain specific truths that you can attribute to air power. Those truths or tenets are that air power is flexible, very mobile, and has the ability to concentrate firepower. Flexibility, as the word suggests, can be looked at in as far as air power is concerned, first from the point of departure by saying aircraft on our own are very flexible. There's no obstacle next to them when they are up in the air, unless there are other aircraft. So the ability to turn quickly, they are agile. But more important, the flexibility we're talking about is the ability to change from one assigned task, or having completed one assigned task, be able to conduct another or other tasks without coming back to land, being reconfigured, and in the olden days, that was true. Flexibility, because when you are on an assigned task or a specific object and you are coming back either back to base or to do something else, on the way there could be fleeting opportunities where you see or you detect and identify a target or a couple of targets that will in the forces achieving a certain objective. Important also these days, with the advance in technology, there are now capabilities of weaponized force in Serbia during the Balkan Wars, particularly in Kosovo. For the first time in history, air forces or air power played the major role in coercing a state into doing what the Allied nations wanted it to do. Serbia succumbed to air power largely. Mr. Chair, probably I should say to me, there are two or three main reasons. I'm saying two or three because I think two of them are linked. But the first one is this country is no longer at war. So as a democratic country now, promoting good relations with everybody. The Cold War was over. The world was no longer polarized. And by the way, with this, it was not unique to South Africa. Many countries around the world had to scale down their level of defense ambition. But there are two other factors in my mind. One, is that technology has played a key role. We mentioned 3 variants of the Mirage 3 aircraft. We no longer need 3 variants. So there's no longer a need to buy a big or to acquire a big fleet, because the capability we have now is multi-role or swing role, depending on how you look at it. One platform can do all reconnaissance, air-to-ground, air-to-air. Money in buying modern technology. You buy less platforms. But in 1990, the first biggest defense cut in terms of budget happened. So there was no longer that big available to the defense force as it was before 1990. Secondly, in 1997, just when these SDPPs were being lifted, there was another huge budget cut. So the choice of technology rather than numbers was also influenced by the budget. So these two are linked in my mind.
I'm sorry, Mr. Slum, just from my own numbers, aircraft. And aircraft. And you say they were acquired from
Money in buying modern technology. You buy less platforms. But in 1990, the first biggest defense cut in terms of budget happened. So there was no longer that big available to the defense force as it was before 1990. Secondly, in 1997, just when these SDPPs were being lifted, there was another huge budget cut. So the choice of technology rather than numbers was also influenced by the budget. So these two are linked in my mind.
I'm sorry, Mr. Slum, just from my own numbers, aircraft. And you say they were acquired from various manufacturers. And now you say today we have only 52 fighter aircraft. And my question is, at the time, out of the 315 aircraft that you referred to, how many of them were fighter aircraft?
55 were fighter aircraft in terms of categorization. So they all fell under the, nowadays I would say, director combat systems. Meaning, whether it was a bomber aircraft or reconnaissance aircraft, in as far as being either a Mirage 3 or a Canberra or a Buccaneer, they were all in the category of fighter aircraft. This 355 I'm referring to doesn't include transport and maritime aircraft, doesn't include helicopters.
Can you just give the commission an indication of the extent of the budget that was committed to the defense force at the time, and indicate as to presently, what is the percentage that you say equal to defense?
The mid-80s, the defense budget was 4.7% of GDP, almost 5%. If you look at it in terms of total government expenditure, it was 25.7% of total government expenditure. Today, the defense budget is about 1.2% of GDP and about 16% of total government expenditure. I speak under corrections, but that's particularly today's figures. I know it's there about 1.2% of GDP.
may we proceed with the witness? The same question. Gentlemen, when we adjourned, we were still busy informing the commission about the helicopters and the evolution relating to helicopter use within the South African Air Force. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We were at the point of adjournment. We were at where the Oryx was developed and where the project to replace the Alouette had started or was starting.
So that the chairperson and Commissioner Musi are with us. We are now dealing with paragraph 30 of the statement onwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We will start now from paragraph 31 of my statement. There, it's another indication or another reference to the fact that in 1990, there was a major budget cut. And the helicopter fraternity within the South African Air Force realized after this that it had to review all its helicopter fleet and how it is composed. As I mentioned earlier, the medium transport helicopter fleet was already being upgraded from Puma to Oryx, and that the future of the Alouette 3 needed to be reviewed. At this point in time, it was becoming more and more difficult to operate the Alouette 3 because the helicopter was also limited in terms of operational use. It was a single engine helicopter, obviously, and also having its limitations in terms of night or poor visibility conditions. Indications at that point were that Eurocopter, which is a helicopter manufacturer in Europe, France, were also going to discontinue the spares production line for the Alouette 3. So this then means consideration was given to extend the life of the Alouette 3. This defense force would run out of spares to operate them. Yes,
I thank you, General. You have mentioned in your evidence that the helicopters would, amongst others, be used as a transport utility. Can you please expand on the use of the helicopter, transport use?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did refer briefly to issues such as trooping when I said that the South African Air Force was gaining more and more experience in the use of helicopters, and that at some point they operated jointly with the Rhodesian Armed Forces in counterinsurgency operations. They did scouting, but they also did trooping. Now, typically, A transport operation for a helicopter would be to carry a certain number of troops from one point to another, usually intra-theater, meaning at the area of operations, or from a point close to the area of operations. Now, a helicopter like the medium transport helicopter, for instance, the Puma, or in this case now is the Oryx, will carry a certain number of troops. It's got 16 seats on board. It will carry 16 troops with their kit from one point to another. But we also do cargo transportation depending on the size, because there's a limitation also. Either search and rescue, where you rescue people and you put them on a stretcher, you know, or supply to ships. If a ship is at sea, not too far from the shore, though, you can take, maybe there's a relief of a doctor on board, or there's some equipment required by the ship because of either the equipment on board has failed or whatever. Also depending on size, the medium transport helicopter will transport those things. Special forces operate in small numbers. So you can also, at night, undetected, insert them into a particular place with it. Those are the transportation duties that I'm referring to.
Right. Thank you, General. Now, post the 1994 democratic elections, the white paper was produced, which would inform the policy on defense. Now, would you like to comment about that before we proceed to paragraph 6, paragraph 36, I beg your pardon, Chair, paragraph 36, which deals with the phasing out, further phasing out of the armament, the Air Force armament?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My colleagues previously did refer to the white paper and the defense review. I think what's important for me to say here is that the development of these two documents followed a consultative process. All stakeholders of this country participated, the general public, government, in terms of the executive and parliament and all of that. So these policy documents are a reflection of the people of South Africa expressing their wish and will as to how this country ought to be defended. But more importantly for me, that collective wisdom said, for this country to be stable, for this country to not be thinking about other things, it needs a defense force to maintain or to put in place a level of deterrence so that any potential enemy or any potential aggressor should think twice about doing that. By this time, though, further defense budget cuts were introduced to the defense force. And the South African Air Force in particular, ma'am, had to then reduce the size of its fleet. And this is where the Mirage F1AZ, the variant that I referred to earlier on, the air-to-ground attack variant, was phased out, and more Impalas were phased out also. I did mention also that at this point, the Impalas were aging very fast, or they were nearing the end of their life cycle very, very fast. So they were becoming obsolete. Yes, ma'am.
General, you have stated that the cheetahs were actually delivered to South Africa even during the early 1990s. And you also now mentioned that the fleet of the South African Air Force was drastically reduced. Regarding that to the fact that in terms of projections, the cheetah was estimated to have been live up until 2012. Is there any reason as to why the cheetahs were also phased out?
Mr. Chair, earlier on I did refer to the fact that the Cheetah was not a brand new aircraft. The Cheetah was a product of an upgrade program, the upgrade of the Mirage 3. With that in mind, one can say, look at the life cycle of the Mirage 3. Then you come to a realization that in any case, the life cycle was going to end within a few years. Mr. Chair, to answer the question directly, yes, the life cycle of the Cheetah was projected to 2012. And we are at 1998. That's roughly 14 years. But where I'm getting at is, if you're going to replace equipment such as aircraft, it takes a long while. The process takes several years. If you look at the process from putting in statements of a required operational capability to the point of delivery, average time could be 10 years. So you do not allow for a gap. You start planning before what is in place right now, before it comes to the end of its life. So the consideration for the SDPPs, and particularly the replacement for the Cheetah, was at the right point in time. Because you had 14 years to work out exactly what you need, looking at the resources available to you, looking at possible future usage, therefore influencing the design or the configuration of whatever platform that you come to choose. And the process of also choosing is involved. It takes time. So I think that's the way I can answer that question.
Thank you very much. Shall we then proceed to briefly touch on the defense review with specific reference development of the force design. The witnesses that testified before him, in particular Admiral Green, has dealt comprehensively with the subject, but now I would like to focus your attention to the force design, especially in relation to the Air Force. Can we hear your comments, please? Whether you can take us through or you just like to make comments, bearing in mind that Admiral Green and Admiral Hicks have addressed the subject sufficiently.
Before you get, can I just get clarity just for my own self? When was this kit introduced and when was it decommissioned?
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. The Cheetah aircraft was introduced to the South African Air Force between 1986 and 1994. The last delivery was in 1994. The first delivery was 1986, the last delivery 1994. That also indicates how long it takes when you acquire equipment such as aircraft or ships. It's the factory has to be configured particularly for that, amongst other things, and they're produced one aircraft at a time. If you know, other big manufacturers might produce 2, 3 at a time, but it takes a while to build aircraft to a specific configuration or to the specs that the customer has put in place, Mr. Commissioner.
Second leg of my question, when was it decommissioned?
So that will be 2008 or just before 2008, but somewhere there, late 2007, early 2008.
Thank you, Commissioner Musa. Now, shall we then revert to the defense review, especially with regard to the force design, General Review?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe, as you correctly put it, my colleagues have elaborated on this, but maybe to just refresh, the main aim of the Defense Review of 1998 was to elaborate on the policy framework contained in the white paper, and particularly on long-term planning, on issues such as structure, force design, force levels, and what armaments will fit those. That was the main aim behind the Defense Review. The guidelines given then out of the Defense Review will, amongst other things, include specifics such as the task that the SANDF will or may have to perform in the future, the manner in which these tasks should be undertaken, the equipment and weaponry required by the SANDF to fulfill those tasks, and reference also to the policy framework contained in the white paper on defense, and more importantly, an analysis of the internal and external security environment. Now, on Wednesday, you asked me about my duties that were involved as Chief Director Ops Development, particularly on capability development, and I mentioned the long-term plan and all of that. Some of this is what we use then to define a desired end state and then work back.
Thank you, General. Shall we then proceed to deal with the defense strategic objectives?
Mr. Chair, the statutory requirement for the Defence Force to defend and protect South Africa, its people, and to support broader government initiative translates into the defense strategic objectives in this manner. First, obviously, is to defend and protect the Republic, its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, its national interest and its people, in accordance with the Constitution and the principles of international law regulating the use of force. But also, to contribute to freedom from fear and want, including the promotion of human security, both nationally and internationally. To contribute to a better life for the people of South Africa. Those are the main defense strategic objectives. Now, you can break some of them into probably clearer terms and definitions for common understanding, but in and of themselves, they are straightforward.
Right, can we then proceed to deal with the force design?
Ma'am, the guidance given by government and the defense review at that time were based on one main principle, that defense planning could be described as needs-driven and cost-constrained. That term, or that phrase, needs-driven and cost-constrained, suggests that only the right level of defense capability is required, right stemming from other considerations. As I mentioned earlier also, this defense force was transformed from a war to a peacetime defense force. And because there was no direct military threat that could be detected and that could be foreseen, therefore, this should be the level of defense. On the other side, what the country was saying, it will be cost constrained because now this country can no longer afford to spend 4.7% of GDP on defense. We don't have enemies. We're shifting our focus to socio-economic issues, human development, and other related issues. So that was the principle guiding the force design, that Defense Force or Department of Defense, as you move ahead, This is how we're going to do things. Yes, ma'am.
Now, in order for the Defence Force to carry out its mandate, and in order to be able to comply with the desired force design from the strategic perspective, the Defence Arms of Service would then have to contribute and inform the department, or rather the South African National Defence Force, about the specific required capabilities. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, yes, that's correct. What I just mentioned earlier, to say the DoD was told this is how we're going to do business from now on, based on that principle of needs-driven cost constraint. The Department of Defense was then obliged to work out options based on that. So several options were developed by the Department of Defense with the input from the SANDF, wherein each service then looked at what might be the best force design.
Now, shall you inform the Commission as to what was recommended by the South African Air Force in relation to the desired options? Then appears in paragraph 46 of your statement, which appears on pages 9 to 10 of bundle G, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, ma'am. I just said that the Defense Review gave us guidelines, and the whole DoD then sat and came up with options. Particularly, there were 4 options that were sent out and one was chosen. In as far as the Air Force was concerned, ma'am, you will see the table on page 10 of my statement. This is what was part of the option that was chosen by government, the Air Force's portion of that.
I just need clarity here, General. Is this list a wish list that came from the Air Force Arm of Service, or is it the ultimate list that was approved by Parliament?
Mr. Chair, this list is part of the option that was chosen out of 4 options, or the option that was decided upon by government out of 4 options. There were 4 options given to government to say we can either go A, B, C, or D, and government chose a particular option, which then included this list. This list is a product of a very, very involved process where a lot of things are looked at, what's available out there, what is happening around technology, what will best suit a balanced defense force.
Right. General, shall we now deal with the questions relating to the absence of military threats? as to why it is necessary for the South African Air Force to maintain a good fighting quality. Because there are arguments that there is no imminent threat of military force, and why is it that the Air Force should continue to be well equipped? Can you just explain?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, since 1994, probably up to date, we do not detect any direct military threat to the Republic of South Africa. We haven't detected anybody or any country that intends to invade or attack South Africa for whatever reason. Having said that, Mr. Chair, it doesn't mean that the country is free from other threats. I want to start by saying, a defense force is a country's insurance policy, if you look at it that way, Mr. Chair. Even many of us sitting here, 100% healthy, no pain, no any condition, but we do take out insurance. We pay premiums. Many of us, it's now matured and things like those. Why? When you're perfectly healthy, why do you do that? The same kind of thinking should be given where a country is concerned. Yes, there are people who say there's no need for a defense force because we are at peace, and they mention other countries that do not have defense forces. We all have opinions, we have freedom of speech, and all of those things. But I think people should also look at things from another angle. It was mentioned here by our colleagues, there are about 21 countries or so that don't have defense forces in the world. But I think many critics do not mention the fact that those countries are either in defense pacts with other countries, or this is assured by another country based on whatever arrangement, whether it's a bilateral arrangement or a multilateral arrangement. Other than that, everybody on this planet, every country has a defense force. And specifically for the reason that I mentioned earlier, it's a country's insurance policy. When the First World War ended and the League of Nations was founded, many analysts and intellectuals and even military people were said that the country, as they referred to the First World War, should be and surely could be the last war that human beings will be involved in, because it was so brutal with so many casualties and unnecessarily so. But hardly 30 years after, another major war broke out. And in between, a country like Spain exploded into a civil war. A civil war that drew in other countries. Germany was drawn in and tested its new equipment there. In fact, Germany gained confidence of some of their capabilities by being involved in the Spanish Civil War. And then the Second World War broke out. A much wider probably even with more casualties than the First World War, because towards the end, we saw the world's first really devastating weapon, the atomic bomb. Two were dropped, one in Nagasaki, the other in Hiroshima. Again, when the Second World War ended, many people thought mankind will come to their senses and won't repeat this. But I want to tell this commission, Mr. Chair, after the Second World War, there have been many, many wars ever in the history of mankind. Today, as we sit here, there's wars around the world. So that part, for me, I'm saying the Defense Force is a country's insurance policy. To then go to the other part of your question, Mr. Chair, there are many threats other than those that are military. This country has to, on a daily basis, attend to issues or activities that could affect our way of life and things like those. As an example, one of the main threats facing this country is organized crime. Organized crime that permeates into a lot of things. Drug smuggling, human trafficking, poaching, and other activities. We as a defense force, in conjunction with the police, for instance, in the border safeguarding activities, we deal with organized crime on a daily basis. If we do not, then I don't know how many do know the situation in Mexico, for instance, where Mexicans on a daily basis live in fear because these drug cartels are actually making Mexico a dying state. So there are threats that need the country to react to, and I believe the Defense Force is one of those state organs, because of their organization and how they are structured and their capabilities, can actually respond to these threats effectively and decisively.
Or absence of immediate military threats, you have mentioned that there is no country that lies bare and operates without security of a defense force, whether directly or indirectly. You have mentioned that some of the countries have concluded pacts with others as a way of seeking for protection from those countries. Now, given the history of the South African Defense Force, given the resources that South Africa has, as well as the size of South Africa, and of most importance is the armament history of South Africa. Would you say that it would benefit the country's people in some way or the other if the government were to opt for the military defense with one or another country? And would that be in execution of its constitutional mandate if it were to opt for that and disband the military or disband the South African National Defense Force?
Mr. Chair, I'll start by saying that would be very, very unfortunate if this country decides to scrap the Defense Force. It will be very unfortunate for many reasons. Because what doesn't come to the fore are the other roles that a defense force plays in a country's economy, in ensuring that technology and such things are maintained and sustained, or, like I said on Wednesday, those capabilities that are lying in the defense force that you won't find elsewhere to respond to disasters, emergencies, and such things. It means then that we need to spend money again. We squash the defense force, or we remove it. We spend money again to set up these capabilities elsewhere. But also, I just painted a scenario of wars. Nobody can predict the future. So the founders of the League of Nations after the First World War were thinking, we are all now shocked to a point where we've come to our senses, no more wars. People realize that Germany as a country, its national psyche was affected. The German pride was affected by the First World War. But they never thought that the Germans will build up to a point where they want to restore their pride and their psychological well-being by being dominant again. No one could predict that. And the Second World War happened with all its violence and whatever else. So we cannot say now, because we're a peaceful country, that nothing can happen. Last week, Spain and Britain were concluding a joint exercise in the Strait of Gibraltar. But at the same time, Spain was upping or was escalating the dispute on Gibraltar. Luckily, both countries probably, wouldn't take rash actions. But had it been there are other factors that will now spark a serious conflict, there is a possibility that war would have erupted between Spain and Britain. Traditionally, allies, friends. There was a border dispute between Botswana and Namibia, a small island on the northwest of Botswana, just about, west, northwest. Both countries claiming this thing, propriety on that island. It was settled at the International Court. But a thing like that could bring about war. South Africa is one of the driest countries in the world, a factor that we don't realize, most of us. If the Katse Dam in Lesotho, or any of the rivers, because most of our rivers do not originate in our country. I think there's one river that originates in South Africa. If those can be affected one way or the other, and there are other issues involved, we could go into war. Anything in human life involving the well-being and survival of people can trigger war. So it will be very, very unfortunate, Mr. Chair, if the defense force is scrapped in this country.
Just one last point on this item. In your response to the questions that I've asked you, spoken about wars in plane. And now, would you say it is rational not to plan for the armament capabilities and the rollout of those capabilities? Would it be rational for South Africa in particular, a constitutional country, not to plan for it?
Mr. Chair, I think the leadership of the country would be shaking their responsibility. And then going back to the scrapping of the defense force or the cancellation of these SDPPs, for instance, they're going to create a vacuum. Because even if we scrap and go back to tender or whatever, at most, the fastest we can replace these more or less will be 7 or 8 years from now, or from the date of scrapping the contracts. But to your question directly, I think that will be shaking responsibility if you don't plan accordingly.
Thank you, General. Mr. Chair and Commissioner Mushi, we are now proceeding to page 11 of the witness statement. We now heading to deal with another subject, and that is the rationale for the SDPPs. Commencing with paragraph 48. Thank you. General, will you please take us through the rationale for the SDPPs as indicated in your statement, and do highlight areas that need to be highlighted. I will from time to time also come in and ask you for some explanations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We did mention the 4 options that were developed and an option that was selected by government. At that time, when the option was decided upon, other processes then kicked in. And amongst them was the selection now of who will be the supplier of what's contained in that option. And many countries then started engaging South Africa, positioning themselves and their products as being the best suited and things like those. A key thing happened around this time, Mr. Chair, 1997. The budget cut of 1997. That then made or compared the DOD to relook at its option, take another look at its option. And it was found that as it is, it might not be affordable. So once the selection process and all of these things were happening, there was a revisit of the option. Amongst other things that were reconsidered was the Army's main battle tank. It was deferred for later, and then particularly the South African Air Force's option, the acquisition of the advanced light fighter aircraft and the future medium fighter aircraft was relooked. Because it would no longer be affordable. And then a proposal was made that we'll go the route of the advanced light fighter aircraft and a lead-in fighter trainer. In this whole time, as these countries were talking, a new concept came in, the concept of packages. Before that, it was just equipment being acquired or procured. We need 57 aircraft, and you buy. You need so many tanks, and you buy. This time, the concept of a package, meaning not just the equipment on its own or, with other things around it.
Yes, you do mention, thanks, General, you do mention in paragraph 51 of your statement that the South African Defence Force, the South African Air Force then, was still operating, or the arms of service were operating in terms of just looking at what their needs are at the time. And you look at what you require for the time as you are phasing out the others. Now that happened prior to the advent of the concept of or the adoption of the concept of the packages, procurement of a package rather than the piecemeal. Now, you have already indicated that there is a time when the South African Air Force had indicated as to what capabilities need to be refurbished or improved on, and then there was a budget cut. And thereafter, or by then I think there was a parallel process relating to the defense review. Now, the defense review came in, then the packages became conceptualized, and it then became a policy of the government to go the package way. Can you tell us as to whether there are any benefits that would have been derived from a change of strategy from having the line arms of service procuring or procuring through the requirements of the line service of arms of service, and changing to doing a full analysis and coming up with a package that should be met?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can only say this. In hindsight, that was the best decision ever taken, particularly in terms of where cost is concerned. That approach saved this country a lot of money. And in as far as the Air Force is concerned, I think the two platforms that came with the SDPPs, or the three, but particularly the two that in the fighter line, the Hawk and the Gripen, were the best buy. Because had we gone differently, I think we would be spending far more than what we have spent already. That's what's, to me, in hindsight, it seems to be.
There is in
Mr. Chair? Yes, I think South Africa was.
Are you there? Are you there? Is it clear? Is it nice and clear? One more. One more. Yeah. Short. Tight block shot. You're gonna use blocks. In studio they're gonna use blocks, so you have to be tight. Zoom in a bit again. It's okay. That is what's going on? They'll come back. Simple. Because they're going to use blocks on it. Sure, sure. Alright, sure. You know, I'm screaming. Doesn't show. There's so much. Anyways, yeah. I understand that. No, but alright, but you know. Never find them. Never find them. Is a lot. Yes, Mr. Babalas. How's the baby? For the first time in my life, I saw you dozing enough. Don't remember that. I'm feeling nice. I'm so. What? T-shirt already in fire. Sure. I don't want it to show. I don't want it to show. I want to it. It's cotton. Not all the way, no? was one in the 86.
Abestoka na yena.
No, 86. It was one over 86. How number 86? Number 20 something. Yeah, it was one over 86.
Amshana 20 mzee.
No, it was 16.
Na marura. Quattro pile,
That's catching up with you today. Sorry about that. You know, I have many things that, you know what I mean? Oh God. You know how many things I've lost in my life? And for it, maybe 10. Yeah, we can check my resume. Let's watch 3. Not 404. Yeah, not 404. 404 is it. Scott, you're gonna go fast. Huh? Eh? Which are you? Huh? Switch it on. Look at it. Switch it on.
Zodi ni tamu.